living there. We saw nobody on the town. It was already evacuated or abandoned.
Residents hoped they might soon be able to return to their homes and businesses. But it quickly became clear this was not going to happen.
To prevent the looting, the Turkish army just fenced the town. It was surrounded by barbed wires and entry checkpoints were erected.
Eventually, an agreement was reached that would bring an end to the war in Cyprus.
It was a short war lasting less than a month, but its effects are still felt to this day.
Varosha was left cut off within the city of Famagusta.
The buffer zone was reinforced and expanded across the whole length of the island.
And you now have a Turkish Cypriot state with its capital at Famagusta to the north of it. And south of the line, you have Nicosia, which essentially straddles the Green Line, but is the Greek capital.
Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Nicosia now stands as the last divided capital in the world.
Today, Varosha is slowly starting to open up again under the supervision of the Turkish Cypriot government.
They've started to clean up some of Varosha, but many of the buildings are still roped off and kept out of public view.
However, visionary plans could help bring this ghost town back to life and into the 21st century.
There's an interesting attempt by Turkish and Greek Cypriots now working together between communities to bring it back as an eco-city, a kind of a blueprint for how to build cities in the future. So there's some hope that that might result in a renaissance in Varosha, but only time will tell.
On the bayou, west of New Orleans, two rotting structures cling to the water's edge.
They're laying down low, almost like an alligator waiting for its prey.
These thick, powerful walls are now starting to shed some bricks.
Inside, it seems they have been left to decay for centuries.
There are dark tunnels, graffiti on the walls, stalactites hanging down from the ceiling. You really don't want to be here.
They show the effects of being in a very damp, humid environment and being battered by the elements.
Their architecture leaves no doubt as to their original purpose.
Clearly, these are brick fortifications, which dates them in the early 19th century.
Built to defend against a foreign foe, these moldering forts bore witness to America's most turbulent domestic moments.
It tells us the history of slavery at its worst and freedom at its hopeful best.
Raymond Berthelot is a local historian who's been coming to these forts for much of his life.
Whenever I was a kid growing up, Highway 90, which runs right outside the fort, was the major route to go towards the beaches in Biloxi and Gulfport and the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So oftentimes we would take a Sunday drive, stop at the forts, have a picnic before carrying on to spend the day at the beaches.
Rarely a destination in themselves today, Forts Pike and Macomb once worked in tandem to control a very different highway.
These two coastal forts were meant to protect New Orleans from naval forces entering Lake Pontchartrain from Lake Borgne, two main waterways that connected New Orleans to the Gulf of Mexico.
New Orleans' position at the end of the Mississippi River had been lucrative, but it also made it a target.
The Mississippi River was the principal highway of the United States for travel and trade. You had to protect New Orleans as the likely place where a lot of American exports would go out of the country and where imports would come into the country.
Whoever controls that port controls the future of the United States.
The importance of New Orleans was made devastatingly clear in the War of 1812.
The United States was a new nation, wanting to assert their power, and this was a real attack. This was a real threat from the British.
The British were beaten back in 1815, just 5 miles from the vital city. But the fledgling United States wouldn't let anyone get that close again. When completed in 1827, the forts used the latest military architecture to protect the vital waterways.
Red bricks were used rather than wood and dirt, and the design was inspired by Napoleonic military structures.
They've got this curved front, which was really quite groundbreaking for the time.
It allows for more cannons to protect the area along the water.
So here what we're looking at is the carriage for a 32-pounder cannon. So the cannon would sit on this carriage with a train track going around the stonework here, so that way that the cannon could swivel and turn and fire out at ships passing by. During wartime, this fort would have held a group of soldiers in the number of 400 to 450.
The forts even housed a secret weapon to deter against any waterborne attack.
These two brick structures that you see here, which somewhat look like oversized barbecue pits, these are what are known as hot shot furnaces. And the way this would work is that fires of coal would be built underneath, and the solid shot would be heated up to red hot and then placed in the cannon and fired. And of course, this fort would have been designed to fire at wooden vessels, and so the very hot shot would act as a burning agent to the wooden vessels once fired out of the cannon.
Heavily armed to defend against foreign invaders, these forts would instead become embroiled in America's internal conflicts.
During the Seminole War, the U.S. government attempted to push indigenous people from their land in Florida.
The idea of the United States government was to move these people out to the western states, onto reservations.
From 1837, these thick walls were repurposed to keep people not out, but in.
They also needed somewhere to hold the imprisoned Seminole people who were waiting for their forced relocation. And Fort Pike had just the right position and accessibility.
So at any given time, there might have been some 70, 80 Seminole men, women, and children here. At the height, this area that you see here would have housed some 237 prisoners. We do have records of a couple of births here as well as a couple of deaths. Now, unfortunately, we do not know where those cemeteries are on the grounds.
It's not known how many Seminole people in total were killed at the hands of the federal government. Around 3,000 were forcibly moved to reservations. But a rupture in the constitutional fabric of the United States would soon make Forts Pike and Macomb a staging post for a different kind of fight back. In January 1861, days before Louisiana seceded from the Union, a new force arrived.
The fort was manned by several U.S. soldiers, and Louisiana militia came and took the site over and declared it as the property of Louisiana. Now, this happened throughout the South, and it was these types of actions that actually sparked Abraham Lincoln to send troops to the South that started the Civil War.
Louisiana militia takes over this federal fort, but then they in turn are attacked from the sea by U.S. forces, which actually don't have to bombard the fort. They just show up with a powerful fleet, and they say, hey, look, we're going to unleash hell unless you surrender.
New Orleans soon fell, and these forts became a base for a new kind of Union soldier.
When the Civil War started, black men who wanted to fight were told that it was a white man's war and they were turned away.
But a brutal first year of fighting forced a rethink.
The Civil War seemed nowhere near an end, and the Union Army desperately needed soldiers. It was no longer a white man's fight.
Formed with a combination of free and formerly enslaved African-American men, many of these new recruits had to learn everything from scratch.
Former slaves were not allowed near weapons when they first enlisted in the Union Army. They therefore needed to be trained to use guns so that they would meet the standard of other Union soldiers.
These forts, once occupied by the Confederate troops aiming to subjugate them, now became their drill yards.
Once black Americans joined the fight, Fort Pike and Fort McComb became training grounds for the U.S. colored troops.
And so here they worked on gunnery, using the guns in the fort itself, and also just basic drill in order to become, federal troops that could then be deployed against the Confederate States of America.
The record of the African-American soldiers trained in these forts was exemplary.
The Native Guard units from Louisiana actually participated in the siege of Port Hudson, which was the first time that African-American troops were used in battle by the United States as a unified force.
With the development of new military technologies during the Civil War, the forts were rendered obsolete. They were soon abandoned to the elements. But their legacy lives on through the people who served here.
After the fort was abandoned, these African-American troops go out west and become the Buffalo Soldiers. So Fort Pike is a very significant aspect of African-American military history during and after the Civil War.
These structures saw slavery at its worst, but ended up becoming constructions of freedom.
Today, they are facing a new kind of attack.
These forts are a constant reminder that as the coast of Louisiana slowly erodes, we are losing not only our landmass, but we are losing our history. We are losing our culture.
On Croatia's Mount Medvednica, high above the city of Zagreb, are the ruins of a ghastly facility.
The snow-coated roads wind through the rugged mountain, which is home to wild boars and wolves.
You get this ominous feeling. You feel isolated and alone.
An extensive complex emerges out of the pine trees.
It has clearly been exposed to the elements for some time.
The buildings and the forest have almost blended together. The trees are coming out of the rooftops of this structure.
It's totally bare and neglected, with rubble scattered everywhere inside.
If Stephen King were here, he would write a scary book about this place.
There are very few clues that reveal the original purpose of this facility.
Built to alleviate suffering, these walls instead became home to personal and political tragedy.
It's the story of love and murder in a monumental national crisis.
Marinko Tot is an investigative journalist who spent 4 years uncovering the truth of what went on here.
Everybody in Zagreb knows there is a big abandoned building up on the mountain, but only a few know the real story, how it was built and what was its true meaning.
If it wasn't for a truly great love story, it may never have been built.
This romantic tale began with the man who helped establish the facility.
The area in which we are right now was an office of the first principal, Milivoj Dežman.
Dežman had a bit of a crush on his childhood sweetheart.
Lady Schramm was a star in Croatian theatre.
She was one of the most beautiful actresses of her age, and Dr. Dežman fell in love with her. He wrote her love letters.
Unfortunately for Dežman, Lady Schramm would go on to marry another man and have children with him.
He didn't give up hope that one day he would be with the woman of his dreams.
Then Lady Schramm's husband leaves her, and this single mother and her child need to be looked after.
Dežman stepped in and invited her into his home. But soon they would be together even more permanently, here at the Brestovac Sanatorium.
In the early 20th century, a cure for tuberculosis hadn't been found, and the world was still reliant on sanatoriums to treat patients of tuberculosis.
Down in the city, there was a lot of industry, a lot of smoke, a lot of coal facilities around. So the place was erected on the mountain because of the easy access to nature and the fresh air for the patients.
This institution is the leading edge of medical science right here in Brestovac.
But the pioneering sanatorium may never have been built were it not for a tragic turn of events. Before construction began in 1909, Lady Schramm had been diagnosed with tuberculosis.
And Dr. Dežman is there for her.
In desperation, he did everything possible to treat his beloved.
He really started to lobby and initiate the public discussion. He was involved in the fundraising and all the permits needed to erect this facility as soon as possible. It is said that the main reason Brestovac exists at this location is because of his love toward Lady Schramm.
She was one of the first patients at Brestovac.
This room where Lady Schramm spent her time is directly above the room of Dr. Dežman. The room was beautiful and she spent a lot of time here. Windows were large, she could see the forest, she could see the city in the valley, she could feel the fresh air, the nature and everything surrounding her.
Despite Dežman's love and determination, in 1913 her condition took a turn for the worse.
In her final days, Dr. Dežman brought Lady Schramm to his private office, where she died in his arms.
After her death, Brestovac entered an era of expansion.
There's a multi-story building and then some ruins, and they're connected by this sort of epic corridor.
We believe that the VIPs were housed in the main building, and there was a degree of separation between classes. And that walkway basically was the bridge between different classes of people accommodated at any given time, because these rooms and services along in this complex are not so spacious. They are really cramped up, and something just built to accommodate as many people as possible.
Tuberculosis struck the high and the low, and as a result, a public facility like this brought all elements of society together.
These new buildings included large wards where poorer patients could be cared for by fewer nursing staff. The sanatorium was beginning to reflect the increasingly fractured world outside its walls.
Because there was a lot of division in society, this facility becomes its own intense little version of the Balkans.
These rifts would see the once quiet hospital ensnared in deadly conspiracy.
It's hard to believe that such a brutal plot would have been conceived right here.
By 1921, the plot was already underway.
This was the Brestovac library. There would have been bookshelves, wooden tables, furniture. It was rather popular. One of the patients here who was sitting at the tables and reading was Alia Aliagic. He was a member of the Communist Party.
Bomb-throwing anarchists, communists, partisans, this part of the world was focused on wild politics.
For Aliagic, only the wildest political statement would suffice.
Later on, in maximum discretion, under the table, in privacy, the library offered, along with his companions, he planned an assassination of the Minister of Interior.
He followed the minister to a park. There, he shot and killed him in cold blood. Aliagic and his comrades were quickly rounded up, and he was sentenced to death.
After that assassination, Communist Party was banned and went underground, where it stayed for the next 20 years.
During the Second World War, these underground forces would return to Brestovac, facing off against invaders and collaborators.
The Nazis control Croatia in part through the Ustasha, the Croatian nationalist fascist militia.
Brestovac was changed to become a hospital for the wounded Nazi and Ustasha soldiers.
By 1945, the communist forces had fought their way back to the sanatorium. They had vengeance on their minds.
When the communist partisans come to these people who have been abusing them horribly for years, the result is an orgy of violence.
They took these wounded soldiers out of the hospital and into the forest and executed them.
Their remains are somewhere in the forests around the facility, still undiscovered today.
Rumors that the ghosts of these executed soldiers still walk the corridors endow it with a still very eerie legacy.
Since its abandonment in 1968, the sanatorium was forgotten and left to decay. But its story is still etched into the city below.
The whole legacy of Brestovac and the love story of Dr. Dežman towards Lady Schramm is so deeply embedded into urban folklore that even one street bears the name of Dr. Dežman, and a rather nice restaurant bears the name of Lady Schramm.
And Marinko hopes that this facility might one day help the people of Zagreb again.
It was inspired by emotion and by really community work in order to erect it, and it was the pride of the city. I'm hoping it will once more be the pride of the city.
In the country of Georgia is an ancient refuge inside a mountain.
Georgia's physical geography is breathtaking, and this part is no exception.
The one thing that catches your eye immediately is this almost vertical rock formation that rises dramatically from the flat floodplain.
It appears to have suffered a cataclysmic event.
The landscape here used to look quite different.
It's as if the mountain had been blown up, and we're getting to see right inside of it.
Where once there was solid rock face, now the hillside is honeycombed with a warren of passageways and cells.
There are long tunnels and many areas hidden from view. It feels like it was a very secretive and defensive place.
But who built this subterranean sanctuary? And why did they hide it from the world? Guram Kipiani has spent many years exploring the ancient city of Vardzia.
Vardzia მე ვნახე გონი მე-9 თუ მე-10 კლასში ვიყავი და მართალი რო გითხრათ კარგად ვერც გავერკვია სად ვიყავი რა მოვლენასთან მქონდა საქმე მე თანდათანობით რაღაც ჩამომიყალიბდა მე არ ვიცი ისეთი ფეოდალური სახელმწიფო რომელსაც ორი ან ერთი მეფობის დროს შეეძლოს ასეთი გრანდიოზული მშენებლობა.
The oldest settlements here date back thousands of years.
Many generations going back to the Bronze Age have cut and honed the rock that is here. The geology is perfect for it.
But the majority of the settlements visible today began life in the 12th century. They got their name when a young girl called Tamar was playing here with her uncle.
Young Tamar got lost in the caves and when called for replied, "I'm here, uncle," which in Georgian has the sounds var and zia, thus giving the place its name, Vardzia.
Amongst the ruins of Vardzia is evidence that Tamar was no ordinary girl.
საყურადღებოა მისი კედლის ხოტრობით, განსაკუთრებით გიორგი მესამისა და მისი ქალიშვილის თამარ მეფის გამოსახული.
Described as a king, as a medieval mark of respect, when she inherited the throne and the half-built Vardzia from her father in 1184, she was beset with enemies on all sides and turned to the tunnels for protection.
The Mongols were trying to expand their territory westward. This part of Georgia was very much in their sights.
It's no surprise the Georgians here wanted to hide. The Mongols were famed for their ruthlessness.
Faced with a seemingly imminent invasion, the Queen ordered a rapid expansion of the cave network.
The only way to enter the city was through a secret tunnel which started at the nearby river.
Vardzia was soon capable of housing tens of thousands of residents, along with its thriving monastic community. All concealed within the mountain.
The underground fortress originally had 6,000 rooms.
This really was a full-on city. There were meeting rooms, reception chambers, a throne room, a bakery, a forge, and a church, all housed in this complex. It took about 50 years to construct, but when you consider that this was all done by hand, that doesn't seem that long.
Its residents had everything they needed to remain self-sufficient for a long time.
წყალმომაგრეების მომარაგების სისტემაა სასმელი წყლის ტრასა, რომელიც გამოყვანილია ყველა ნიშნის მიხედვით ზემო ვარძიიდან. ქვაბული მიჩნეულია, რომ წყლის რეზერვუარი იყო და წყლის სასმელი წყლის მარაგი ინახებოდა.
But before the Mongol armies could put Vardzia's defenses to the test, Queen Tamar had to face off against a different threat.
The Battle of Barzayan is one of the most important battles in Georgian history.
Confronted by an overwhelming force of Seljuk Turks, it fell to the queen to inspire her nervous troops.
Queen Tamar is said to have addressed her army here at Varzia, walking barefoot down to the valley floor where her troops were amassed.
The Georgians successfully fought off the Seljuk Turks and confirmed their status as the absolute power in the Caucasus.
When Tamar died in 1213, she left her nation stronger than ever. And Varzia continued life as a cultural and religious center.
This was the zenith of the Kingdom of Georgia.
But military prowess could not protect the underground city from what was coming.
1283 was a tragic year for Varzia. A huge earthquake struck, destroying vast parts of the cave city.
The thing about the earthquake is that it totally ruined the city's disguise.
The mountain face slid off with the extreme tremors, exposing the caves within.
No longer hidden from the world, Vardzia's importance slowly diminished. Out of the rubble of the devastated city, one aspect of life returned.
After the earthquake, a small religious community persisted.
They faced attacks and persecution in the now exposed caves. But a small number of their descendants have managed to continue their legacy today.
The remaining monks still live like their brethren from centuries past. They collect their drinking and bathing water from the nearby ancient underground spring.
But mainly it's tourists that you will see wandering these